Good afternoon.
Cindy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second FPCI Ambassadorial Lecture in cooperation with the delegation of the European Union to Indonesia. FPCI is proud to host this series, in which today we have here with us His Excellency Ambassador Vincent Piket, Ambassador of the European Union to Indonesia. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
A couple weeks ago, we had our first ambassadorial lecture in Jakarta with students from 6 universities, and today we are joined by students from Malang, namely Universitas Brawijaya and Universitas Muhammadiyah Malang. Welcome everybody, and thank you to our FPCI chapters for tuning in. It's not every day that university students can get the chance to have a one-on-one dialogue with the ambassador, so I'm certain that we'll have a very interesting and insightful discussion today. My name is Cindy, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, this ambassadorial lecture series aims to discuss various aspects of the bilateral relations between Indonesia and the European Union, especially during the unprecedented time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, our topic of discussion will be EU on the most pressing world agenda 2020. So don't forget to share your moments with us from this dialogue by tagging at FPC Indo and at uni_Eropa on your social media posts. Now, before we begin, I would like to invite the founder of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Dr. Dino Patijalal, to deliver his welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Cindy, and I'm glad to see my good friend, Ambassador Vincent Piket here, and thank you for agreeing to speak to the students. And I want to send my hello to all the students from UMM, and also from Brawijaya universities. And really bilateral relations also on the,
sorry, but you're breaking up.
This is really a very interesting year, and it's all very
Sorry.
There seem to be some technical difficulties, so we'll move to another computer. One second.
Yeah, I'm back now. I'm in the other room. Yeah, but I was just saying this is I think the strangest year of my life. Maybe for everybody else, this is the same. Not just because of COVID-19. COVID-19 alone is bad enough, right? But questions are being raised about globalization, about the international order, about free trade, about multilateralism, about nationalism, right? And even this morning we had a session on terrorism, and I think the consensus was that terrorists are even more active now. In the United States, the far right terrorist groups, according to the American expert, are getting more emboldened, right? In the Philippines also there are more attacks by suicide bombs and so on. That's only on terrorism alone, right? And we have a whole bunch of agenda. And I can't tell you how important Europe is in the midst of all this. European Union is coping with COVID-19, and there's a lot of pressures on it. But the world also expects leadership and a strong role on the part of European Union to address a lot of the global issues, including climate change, regional security, trade, and so on. So with that, I hope you will make use of this discussion to pick the brain of Ambassador Vincent. He's a top diplomat, very open. He knows what's going on. He's a policy wonk. Policy wonk means somebody who knows policy details inside out. And his opinion, I hope you will turn into essays and research papers for your class. I really hope that you will have a good discussions today. And I will turn off because I don't want to be sounding like a big brother who's watching this discussions. But thank you very much, Vincent, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Pak Dino, for the opening. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let us now begin today's discussion. So may I invite His Excellency Ambassador Vincent Piket. The floor is yours.
Well, let me thank Dr. Pak Dino very, very much for once again inviting me to the FPCI podium. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me, for my diplomatic mission here in Jakarta. We prize a lot the cooperation with FPCI, which I think is without a doubt one of the liveliest foreign policy platforms on earth, and very vibrant community, and which is fantastic for the development of the human resources in young people dealing with international relations in whatever form. And of course, it's a fantastic resource for your country, a fast-moving, fast-growing country with a developing, evolving foreign policy role and weight in the world, thanks to its growing economic strength. So a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm glad that we can cooperate, my mission and FPCI, on this series. Happy to be speaking to students in a city here in Java, not that far away from Jakarta, but still I haven't been there, unfortunately. I've read about your city. It's attractive, it sounds, with a mild climate, even though I imagine that a mild climate in Indonesia means something different than a mild climate in Europe, particularly in northwestern Europe, where I'm from. I'm by origin the Netherlands. In our case, mild means something like 12, 15 degrees Celsius, and I imagine that's not the case in Malang at all. But it's probably a little bit cooler than in Jakarta, and I would imagine also with some cleaner air. And besides, you have the view of the fantastic Bromo volcano a little bit down the road from you. So greetings to the university students collected here. Great honor to be talking with you, and I really hope that this will be a discussion, not just a statement from my side and some questions, but that we all try to engage despite the limitations of this digital medium. I've been in Indonesia now for 10 months already. 10 very special months. First of all, of course, because as a newly arrived ambassador in a country like this, you have plenty of things to discover professionally, but also privately, in terms of finding out where you live a little bit, trying to discover the regions, the country, the people, the cultures, and of course the food, which I do with great pleasure. 10 months working now in a diplomatic mission, which has about 60 staff, of which 1/3 is European staff like myself, and the other 2/3 are locally hired staff who work with us on all policy areas, whether it's the political analysis, the economic and trade analysis, managing the rather numerous projects for cooperation which we run here, and of course helping us out on the administration of our office. The particularity of my mission is that it has this one mission with two ambassadors. I'm the ambassador accredited to Indonesia and to Brunei Darussalam. There is one other ambassador. His name is Igor Drismans, and he is the EU's ambassador accredited to ASEAN, which is a self-standing remit and a self-standing accreditation coming from the presidents of the European Union. But we are co-located in the same office, and of course we interlink a lot on the various agendas that we have in front of us. Now, coming to the topic of the discussion this afternoon, the most pressing world agenda in the wake of the pandemic crisis, or in the midst of the pandemic crisis, maybe I should still say, and what is the EU's take on that? What are our priorities? What are the key tasks? And how do we see the cooperation with international partners, and especially, of course, with Indonesia on this? Now, the assignment of this afternoon is colossal. COVID is a crisis like none of us have ever experienced in our lives. Even the more seasoned people among us will not have anything to compare this with in their life experiences. It's a crisis that has shaken and is shaking the foundations of our societies, the foundations of how we used to look at things, and whether it was politics or security or the economic development, the trade agenda, as well as our institutional makeup. It has shaken the administration of countries, of the EU, and rudely awakened us, I think, to the realization that we're a lot more vulnerable, a lot more exposed to potential trouble and dangers than we ever thought. Of course, we had the financial crisis about a decade ago, 2009 and after. It was deep, maybe not so much here in Indonesia, but certainly in Europe it was. But it was a financial crisis with heavy economic impact, social impact, with political reverberations, of course, but not a crisis, I think, that shook the pillars of our way of governing things, of our societies and of our value systems in the way we see now. The crisis took us by surprise, like everybody else. We were not prepared. We were taken aback. There was a panic at the start. There were panic reactions at the start. There was a focus on individual countries by the individual member states at the start of the crisis, which caused frictions, of course, between member states. And so it was very, very profound. Fortunately, we have moved on a lot. After this initial shock, we have managed, I would say, a way forward that, of course, on the one hand, it does two things. First of all, respect the fact that under EU law, public health is a national member state competence. There is no EU Ministry of Health. There are national ministries of health, and they are in charge of the public health for their countries. But secondly, we have worked hard on seeing where the value added of EU action is and was, and defined not a perfect approach forward, but certainly a consistent and fairly coherent approach. Whether you look at it from the pandemic response, the pure medical side, to the socio-economic response as well. And now the phase we're in Europe is looking beyond the crisis response and trying to define the post-COVID socio-economic recovery. What are our key worries or our key priorities? I think first of all, of course, make sure that the COVID pandemic remains under control. We are beyond the peak, very clearly, all member states individually and all of us together. But the virus is still there, like it is here. It is still there in Europe, and there's no way we can relax. We will have to fight each and every new case of spreading, often very localized, fortunately, and deal with that in the instance immediately through medical response, through social isolation and containment. The risk of hotspots exists, but on the whole, with the experience that we have gained over the past 4 months, we are a lot better prepared to deal with it. Situation is clearly different from how it is here. Indonesia's peak is still developing. We're not beyond it yet. So there's a very special and very difficult challenge for the authorities to deal with, and it is to reconcile coping with the pandemic on the one hand and making sure that the peak flattens and turns into a decline, and secondly, do what is reasonably and responsibly possible to reopen the economy and reopen society. Because it is clear that the economic impact, is heavy. Globally, there is a very big challenge, and that particularly has to do with vaccines. Nobody has one yet. Everybody hopes to discover it, evidently, but we are nowhere near predicting with safety when that will happen, when a vaccine is identified and tested, and secondly, when a vaccine can be distributed to the people who are vulnerable. And you're talking about not just a task we have of developing a vaccine in order to save lives and to protect lives. That is, of course, the bottom line. But certainly also, without a vaccine, there will remain a big question mark about our economic and social rebound. If the foundations of medical predictability, if the foundation of a disease, of a pandemic which is under control isn't there, then of course it will be very hard to get to a sustainable growth track. So our focus as EU has been very much therefore on developing that vaccine. We're investing millions and millions of euros in research by the universities and the research institutes, research by the pharmaceutical industry, of course, and in order to get one soon. We see this task not as a purely European task on our continent. No, this has to be a global matter for very simple reasons. it makes no sense. It's useless even to just vaccinate your own house. If your neighbor's house is not vaccinated and the risk of the disease outbreak remains there. So for the EU, the philosophy and the approach has very much been a multilateral one, which stresses two things. First of all, to make sure that the richer economies put up a lot of funding for this pledge funding for research that has as purpose to serve an international need. And secondly, we have always stressed that when we find a vaccine or when there is one to be produced and so on, we very much believe that it must be made accessible to all, particularly, of course, the poorer countries and who themselves have no capacity to develop a mixed vaccine. So it is a very strong belief in the need, the practical need for concrete solidarity here that we see as a necessity, not an option, but a necessity for getting the pandemic under control globally and for building a sustainable basis for the economic rebound. Here, the word global governance comes in, of course, by the UN system and very especially by the World Health Organization that has been heavily criticized by some countries, but particularly, of course, by the US. Yesterday, the American president signed and sent his letter to the UN Secretary General saying the US was withdrawing from the WHO officially. The EU's response is different. We support the multilateral system. We support the WHO, and we believe that the organization has to continue to be capable of doing its vital job at this present time. It doesn't mean that we have no opinion about the performance and that we don't want to review the performance of the WHO, but that is something that we can do later on and as we go along while we deal with our first priority of combating the pandemic in the first place. So that is pressing issue number one by far, dealing with the COVID crisis and getting us back on a medically sustainable basis, foundation for our economic rebound. I'll talk about that, the economy. Heavy impact in Europe, -8% decline in our economic growth predicted for this year. And next year, yes, we expect to be rebounding, but not enough to compensate for the loss of the present year. Indonesia is hit as well. The figures show it. You see it also in the streets, in the shopping malls, etc. So there is a major task for each and both of us to do. In many respects, for Europe, the COVID crisis has wiped out the economic and social gains we made after the financial crisis of 2009, both in terms of economic growth, in terms of job losses. So many people are back in unemployment, jobless, with a particular impact on young people. We have companies who have become heavily indebted, of course. They had to stay alive without having customers, with demand having slumped to close to zero levels. But they had their companies, their assets on the payroll. And of course, there is a major debt piled up for them for the years to come. And we haven't seen the end of it yet. If you look at it globally, then of course you can only conclude also that the impact will be especially once again on the poor countries. They suffer most in such circumstances. They are least equipped, have fewest resources to deal effectively with the pandemic, and hence they are back on the set back on the track to achieving the social sustainable development goals by a year or 2 years or more. We haven't got the full picture of that yet. So one big implication is for the EU, but also for all of us, is we have to see how we can help these poorest countries get back. Our High Representative for the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security Policy has said that we have to consider debt relief for that as a possible tool to help the third countries, the poorest third countries, out. It sounds very altruistic, and maybe it is, but at the end of the day, it's about enabling the poorest countries to maintain stability and maintain their sovereignty in dealing with the crisis. If you look inside our economies, inside the EU, inside Indonesia and elsewhere, and you ask yourself the question, who are hardest hit by it? And then also at the country level, at the level of a region like Europe, you have to conclude it's once again the poor. It's the people in the lower income groups, lower middle income group maybe, especially in the services sector, retail, tourism, transport, logistics. And it's again the young people, and we haven't seen the end of it yet. We haven't got the full picture, because at the end of the day, there's still this summer, the European summer now. Many young people graduating from school, from the universities, from the vocational schools, and coming on the job market by the 1st of August, the 1st of September, and then finding out that the jobs that they'd hoped for and were trained for do not exist or do not exist now. So we have a major expectation of unemployment growth, especially among the young. It's at an EU average. Youth unemployment now stands at 14%, but that is bound to rise. Now, that's a very stark economic and social fact with a heavy impact on individual people. But it is also a societal fact, in the sense that this impact, this sense of being hurt, and particularly the sense among the poorer groups of being hurt by the crisis, leads to an aggravated sense of inequality. And inequality, social inequality, income inequality, of course, has been an issue for all developed economies ever since the financial crisis started. We see that the crisis hit these lower income groups. The white collar, myself, white collar workers were safe in many cases. We continue to do our work from home. a taxi driver, a Bluebird driver, a Gojek driver cannot do so. There is a risk of the sense of losing out, of having lost, also engendering, that can also engender sense of increased inequality. So what does that mean? It means that governments all over the world, but certainly in Europe, and I would imagine also here in Indonesia, we have to push hard forward with our economic stimuli, with financial support for companies to allow them, to enable them to weather the crisis, and stimuli for job schemes. Otherwise, we risk having a situation where economic and social impact also turns into a massive societal impact. If you look at the global level, then another impact and pressing problem has to do with trade, with the role of trade in our economies, in our societies, in our policies abroad. The crisis has naturally led in many places to a sense that we are vulnerable. Globalization is great. It has opened many opportunities and made us all richer, globally speaking. But it has also increased the dependencies, the interdependencies between economies for their economic growth. And of course, interdependencies can be good, and they have been good, but they also may create exposure to risk. And so as a result, there has been a tendency to think in many places, we have to relocalize, renationalize certain industries that we do not have any longer, didn't have any longer, and in order to be less dependent on others. For the EU, this is not the option. Let's face it, first of all, that we are an integrated economic bloc with 27 member states, with one big internal market. And so it is totally impossible within an EU setting to start doing anything like a relocalization of industries to your own territory within the EU. But also looking out, it's not the formula we opt for. Yes, maybe we will want to make sure that certain industries are better protected and that we are not critically at a loss in case the international system breaks down or slows down or whatever. But for us, there's no option to cease being part of the global supply chains, of the systems whereby European firms sell goods in Europe and elsewhere across the world that are made with components that are bought and produced all over the place in all continents. We cannot do away with that. It would be inefficient, and it would be probably impossible in many respects to do it. So no stepping out of global supply chain. What we may want to do is diversify supply chains and make sure that we are not over-dependent on one single or two big suppliers, but have more partners around the globe on who our industry relies for their supplies and components. Now, this of course presupposes one thing, and that is the governance of the global economy and the governance of the global trade system. And here we have an issue. The WTO is possibly at its weakest since a long time. There's a leadership crisis at the moment, and hopefully that can be partly solved by the imminent appointment of a new Director General. But secondly, the whole trust and the whole faith and the whole abidance by the global trade system has gone down. There is a sense that some problems can be solved by bilateral action. The United States has stepped out of the panel that rules on the dispute settlement cases. And now, if there is no dispute settlement system in the WTO to rule about compliance or not of trade behavior, then of course you could be pretty much lost. Now, we don't sit still in that situation. The EU has said we're going to, if the WTO can't do it at the moment, maybe in the future, but not now, we'll find an alternative, a parallel system. And for that reason, the EU and 18 other countries, the larger economies of the world, many G20 countries, have set up this alternative dispute settlement system, which we believe can be at least a temporary antidote to the undermining of this dispute settlement pillar of the WTO. We're seeking more participants for that system over and above the 18 countries we already have. And evidently, Indonesia has been invited to consider this option as well. And so we hope to have a dialogue with Indonesia on that. Now, a few more points on the economy and on disparities, inequalities. Clearly, you've heard me already say our steadfast support for the multilateral system. We want it to continue. We will protect it. The second thing that is on our agenda is within the notion of diversifying our supply chains. We will, in a very consistent and persistent manner, continue with our free trade agreements around the globe. We have many of them. We are probably the most interconnected region globally through bilateral free trade agreements. And in Asia, with South Korea, with Japan, with Singapore, with Vietnam, agreements in force. And of course, we are negotiating a free trade agreement with Indonesia. It's in fact called differently. As you may know, it's called a Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean that this is not just about tariffs and duties and market access quotas and the law. It is also about a number of more horizontal topics that are vital for the way we wish to run our bilateral trade and our economies. So it has to do with things like, very practical things like standards, with industrial standards, with veterinary, phytosanitary standards. It has to do with rules for geographic denominations. For instance, the Arabica coffee is a protected denomination for Indonesia, which we will respect in Europe. So there's no European Arabica coffee. Never will be. Anyway, yours is much better. So why would we make it? But also rules for state aid. How do we support companies that are restructuring and what are the conditions for that? And this is not an ideological debate. No, it's about ensuring fair competition between our companies and the Indonesian firms, and making sure that everybody has a chance. It's about sustainable development. There's going to be a chapter in our agreement on that, on how do we see the connection between trade, production trade, and protecting of biodiversity, of contributing to the climate agenda, etc. So a very, very broad agenda, and it's for that reason no wonder that this takes a couple of years to negotiate, but we're doing pretty well, I can say, and so that I do expect that in the not too distant future we can have a result. A third point I should mention is that especially to help the poorer economies around the world, the EU is making available a lot of funding strictly related to COVID, on top of all the other funding that we also anyhow we're giving to these countries. 20 billion euros total, so calculate quickly the rupiahs, and it's a lot of rupiahs, 20 billion euros for third countries, including 350 million rupiahs for the ASEAN countries, and within that there is 20 million euros for Indonesia. We do this in the mode of what we call Team Europe, whereby we mean to say that this is not just money coming from the EU budget, but it's also money coming from individual member states. So it is a combined effort, a combined signal of solidarity and cooperation by Team Europe and the whole of the EU to our foreign partners. The rebound and the green agenda. Important point. At the end of the day, COVID may have pushed the climate change to the background, but it is still there and it's not stopping. On the contrary, it continues, and in almost every day or every second day you read something in the newspaper where you see the signs that climate change is true and cannot be denied, as some continue to try to do. And here again you have a topic that you can't solve, probably you can't solve just on your European continent or just in Indonesia. It's a topic that has to be solved globally through global action with the multilateral framework, the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC process. The last summit was postponed and has to be held next year. But we have to work with it and get on with it and continue to work on our carbon cut, emissions cut strategies and implement them. For the EU, the choice is very clear. Our economic recovery post-COVID has to be also a green recovery. We have on the table our new policy called the Green Deal, a proposal made by the European Commission to member states. Look it up on our website, Green Deal. You will see that there's a massive amount of individual policy measures behind it in all sectors of policy, in agriculture, in energy, in transport, in the industry, in all finance, green finance, very important. all leading to one strategic goal, and that is to make the European Union carbon neutral by the year 2050. Carbon neutral, circular, fully green, and sustainable. That's a very challenging goal, not easy, especially not now when new resources are scarce. But still, we are convinced we have to push on with this. It's not easy also politically, because at the end of the day, as within ASEAN, in the EU, member states differ, have differing economic strengths, have differing energy production portraits. In some member states, there is a classically or traditionally has been always in a stronger reliance on coal, for instance. So their transition will be harder, will be maybe longer, and will be more costly. And the discussion now is how to accommodate those differences between member states within that global goal of carbon neutrality, and how to support those member states who need it with extra funding to help them make it happen. What do we want to do in the relations with Indonesia? Now, it's very clear. This is a very large country, a very large economy, a massive population, one of the biodiversity treasures in the world, a massive carbon sink in your peat lands, in your forests. So we have every interest as EU to cooperate extremely closely with Indonesia to help support your green and sustainability and climate agenda. We're committed to that. We have good policy dialogue, not always easy, but we have it. The past 2 weeks we had 3 days in a row video conferences between Jakarta and Brussels about environment, climate matters. Very concrete and I hope very promising in terms that we can turn that into a longer term partnership, a longer term green partnership. Not forget the security dimension of climate change, which is real. Climate change uproots communities. It changes the courses of rivers. It causes famine and drought in parts, and as a result, it leads to migration, etc., as well as to risks of instability. So it's a real issue globally, but very important also for the EU. And it's therefore worth mentioning that Germany, which took over the EU's rotating presidency on the 1st of July, Germany has put the issue of climate and security on the agenda of the EU, but also of the Security Council of the UN. A word about security and COVID. Pagdino referred to it already. We live in a very chaotic moment right now, with all sorts of new security challenges coming up, or some old ones manifesting themselves in new forms or with greater intensity. Is it caused by COVID? Maybe not, but certainly COVID may have contributed to a new sense of this new sense of instability and insecurity. And it was therefore, in a way, very, very with great foresight that the UN Secretary General a number of months ago, at the time when the COVID crisis started, that he called for this reduction in violence, a global ceasefire, he called it, and I think that politically was extremely well taken. Unfortunately, on the ground, in many cases, we haven't always seen the follow-up by individual leaders and or groups of people. So this is a major thing to worry about, a major thing for pressing issue, as you put it in the title of the seminar. Something that where the UN, in particular the Security Council, has got to play a tremendous role, where the regional organizations, such as the EU, but also ASEAN, I think, have to play a role, and through mediation, through conciliation, through support to peace processes and similar operations, try and stem these regional or sub-regional hotbeds out. Indonesia has been a major supporter of the UN peace operations for decades. It's very much valued and appreciated around the globe, and the EU is one of those admirers of that. So Indonesia's contribution is vital. It's a painful contribution at times, and 2 weeks ago, the one UN Blue Helmet soldier from Indonesia was killed in Congo. Painful, and we very much hope and that Indonesia will be able to continue this strong role. I have no doubt about it, to be honest. Indonesia is a great multilateralist. Your foreign minister makes that very clear in many of her speeches. Lastly, on human rights, COVID and human rights. You may wonder why I bring this up, but maybe not. Maybe you had expected me to start with it. Clearly, COVID has had and is having impacts on human rights. First of all, it's again the story of the COVID crisis hitting the weakest first. And let's face it, regardless of what countries, including Indonesia and the EU, have achieved on creating equality between men and women in economic life, social life, etc. It's mostly the women that are hit in terms of the job losses. Statistics of Europe show it, because typically they work in the services sector jobs that are mostly affected by the crisis. So here you have an impact on human rights, on the equality of men and women. It's not discrimination, but it's the result of the way our societies function. A second dimension has been the tendency in some countries to resort to means for dealing with the COVID crisis that do sometimes seem difficult to reconcile with the belief in freedom of expression, freedom of media, and civil rights. Now, of course, in crisis situations, you need crisis tools to deal with the problem and to overcome the crisis. Everybody understands that. Everybody accepts that. But the key thing, and that's the phase we're in right now, is whether or not the governments, the parliaments that have decided such measures will be gradually, after the peak of the crisis, go back to the pre-existing system or move forward to an even better system. So that is a very important and I think pressing point to follow on the agenda of domestic agenda of many countries. There is an international dimension to that, of course, and that is through the UN bodies again, the membership of countries in the UN Human Rights Council, and Indonesia is there at the moment. So I do look forward. They're very interesting to see how that debate unfolds at that level. I'm going to stop there by simply saying that having giving you this snapshot of what keeps us focused on right now in the EU, and indicating some of the links that we see between and the implications we see for the relations between the European Union and Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Piket, for the very insightful lecture. So now let's go ahead and dive into our question and answer session. So I will be taking 3 questions per batch, which will be then answered by Ambassador Piket before moving on to the next batch. So in this first batch, to ask your question, you can use the raise hand feature on your Zoom app by clicking participants and then selecting raise hand on the bottom right. And I will be selecting the first 3 who have raised their hands. Okay, so for the first question from UMM, Luke Karimah, please state your name and your question, but do limit it to 1 question per person. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Of course. Yes, thank you. Good morning. I mean, good afternoon. My name is Luka Karima from the University of Muhammadiyah Malang, and I have one question regarding about the EU. The ambassador already told us about the health system. It's in each EU country is being controlled by the each country government. But then in the last part of the lectures, the ambassador told us about the EU effort for the equality between men and women. But the pressing matter in COVID-19, it's not only about job, but it's also about the healthcare system of in some countries, because I've known that some countries in the EU, some like Romania, Slovakia, has been uphold some kind of some facilities for in this era of COVID-19, which actually have a big impact for women, which is the abortion system of healthcare. So in this case of how some countries actually violated some women rights regarding about the healthcare system in their country, is EU actually can intervene these countries and maybe like told them to activated some kind their abortion system again in their country, because there are a lot of women that actually have a big impact of the abortion system that is being on hold in these countries. So yes, can AU actually can intervene? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. Now for the second question from UMM, Fikri Muhammad Reza.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Fikri Muhammad Reza from the University of Muhammadiyah Malang. My question, I would like to ask a question, regarding the European Union integration. As we all know, alongside before the COVID-19, the most booming topic in the European nation is the rise of the right-wing political party of movement. And some already disintegrated from the EU, such as the Britain Brexit movement that's already came into fruition, and there are some like agenda such as the Grexit or the Greece exit, and a few right-wing political party like winning the seat in the election, such as the Five-Star Movement in Italy, and Swedish Democrat winning a lot of seats in Sweden. So my question is, how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will affect the future of the European integration, when it comes to this integrating from the European Union is left. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fikri. And last for this first batch from UMM, Yusril Iza.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Yusril Iza Mendra, and I'm from University of Muhammadiyah Malang. And we know that European Union has been one of the biggest economic partner of ASEAN, of course, beside USA and China, and some 30% of foreign direct investment from European Union in ASEAN countries has been allocated in manufacturing sector. But as pandemic happened, we could see that many factories must stop or cut their production activity. And as the result, many of them suffer from losses. And my question is how European Union responds to this kind of problem, and how do you expect the future economic and investment cooperation between both parties after pandemic? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusril. Back to Ambassador Piket.
Thank you. So, three very interesting questions, very different in their substance. I start with the first question from Ms. Lucke from about the women's rights in health and in healthcare. First of all, I refer to your first part of the first part of your question. Healthcare and public health are sovereign responsibilities for the individual member states, and the EU at EU level doesn't do that. We do not manage hospitals. We do not manage the health insurance systems in countries individually. What the EU does is strictly focused on the things that need to be regulated at the EU level for the sake of the functioning of our internal market, for the sake of the social cohesion of the European Union and the member states, and for the sake of the overall implementation of the EU's objectives. Now, the internal market, for instance, depends, among other things, on the possibility for workers who are insured of one nationality, who are insured there, to move work for a shorter or longer term to another EU member state, and to somehow manage that transition, that move, that relocation, also in terms of healthcare. And so, in other words, an EU national, when she or he moves to a different country, is entitled to healthcare there, and that is totally irrespective of whether you're a woman or a man. Now, you mentioned, suppose there's something, there's a problem in member states living up to this or that law or that rule, then there's two ways to go about it for the EU, if there was a real issue. Is first of all, of course, to use the procedure in our treaty to ask member states to improve the record, to set things right, if you like. There's a procedure in that with a letter and a second letter, and then in the last instance, the European Commission is capable and has the possibility of taking member states to court. So that is one way of going about it. The second way is, if it is a pure human rights aspect, then there is the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, which is not directly linked to the European Union as such, but to the Council of Europe, our sister or brother organization. And so that's another track. We have, moreover, within our treaty, a possibility of taking action against member states in case there is a persistent failure to live up to the EU basic principles and so on. So I'm not entering into the specifics of the cases you mentioned. I don't know them, to be very honest. But there is what I mean to say is that there is a very sophisticated apparatus in existence that backs up the EU's fundamental values, our treaty on human rights and civil liberties and fundamental values. So we have that system to protect it and to consolidate it. And I'm sure that if there was a case to be made, the persons concerned would be able to follow that path. The second question from Mr. Fikri about the impact of COVID on the European integration project, which is what it is. We are a project in many respects. That's what it. Even our treaty says so, that the EU is unfinished, and it will continue to evolve in function of the perceived needs, in function of the political goals, the economic circumstances, and geopolitics, etc. Is it impacted by COVID? I don't think so. I read the other day, I forget when it was, but some opinion poll suggesting that ever since the start of the COVID crisis, popular support for the EU has risen, and which is interesting, because it would be a confirmation of similar polls last year before the crisis started, and so there must be, in the eyes of the people who were polled, there must be something that the EU did well, with all the qualifications you wish to make and so on, but still. So that is one thing. Secondly, look at, you mentioned Eurosceptic political parties. Yes, they do exist. But if I look at the two most recent elections in Europe, in Greece and in Croatia, two smaller member states on the Mediterranean, where there existed right-wing parties, left-wing parties, who won in both cases? The centrist parties, the mainstream parties. So whatever, whatever the concerns might have been, the fact of the matter at the end of the day in the polling booth is that the result was different. And with the strong support from the voter in the national elections. It was the same in the European elections last May, not last May, but May last year, where there was also a stronger an increase in the support for the pro-EU parties. Not necessarily always the mainstream parties, because the Green parties won massively, but certainly they're all pro-EU and supportive of the EU's leadership in key areas that affect the voters' lives. Now, is the problem solved? Of course, it is not solved. Euroscepticism is something that that is a reality that is in the mind of many people. And what can you do about it? Of course, as EU, the only thing you have is action. Do things that people recognize as valuable for their lives. And that is a challenge the EU has always had, and particularly now has to demonstrate. Now, bear in mind very well that the EU is not a small bunch of people working in the EU institutions in Brussels and, in my case, in Indonesia. The EU is everybody. The EU is the EU institutions, but also the member states. So this is to prove that the EU can work and does deliver the goods is a common challenge we have. Everybody has to contribute. Everybody has to support the goals once they are decided. And everybody has to give credit to the EU once something good has happened and once something good has been achieved. And that, of course, is something that the EU leaders at EU level have to do, but also the national leaders at their level. And the last thing I would say is you mentioned the Brexit. You mentioned the other acronyms that were derived from it in relation to other member states. Now, I can tell you in very simple terms that the experience of Brexit has been so difficult and excruciating, visibly for everybody inside Europe, that the drive towards Brexit for, among other countries, exiting the EU has gone down massively. And I think that we have turned that corner definitely. And in the latest polls that I saw, we have seen this increase in support for the EU. So that's what we bank on, and that's what we have to push on for, also particularly in post-Brexit. The last question from Yusril. The economic response. This is a big topic. It's too much, so much that it's very hard to summarize it in just a couple of words. But the bottom line is that we have done a lot in terms of funding for member states and for companies in order to enable them to bridge the COVID peak, to stay alive, to avoid bankruptcies that they would have suffered otherwise. So that is the immediately crisis support to economies, to firms, for keeping people out of unemployment, for subsidizing salaries in certain sectors and certain regions. So that is one big activity. Secondly, that's what's starting now is financing the rebound. So the activities, the sectors, the financing mechanisms, the investment mechanisms that companies and governments can draw on in order to kickstart the rebound of our economy. So there's more longer-term investment coming from all parts of the EU system, including from member states themselves. Again, Team Europe. So the EU budget, the European Investment Bank, which is the biggest lending bank in the world by far, far, far bigger than anybody else. European Investment Bank will also land in Indonesia soon. And the European Central Bank, which has made available massive liquidity to member state governments and to EU banks through this bond issuing scheme. Bond purchasing scheme. So those have been the big contributors to the second leg of work, and that is financing the rebound. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now for the second batch, we'll take from UMM, Auki Adi Kurniawan.
Hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Can you hear my voice? Okay. My name is Auki Adi Kurniawan. I'm from the University of Muhammadiyah Malang. So, talking about Islamic phobia issues, with still the existence of Islamic phobia in some European Union countries, is there any formula or strategy in the future to strengthening and enhancing the existing framework in order to overcome this problem in the future, especially to tackling the rising of Islamic phobia and to give protection for the Muslim resident or Muslim community in European countries? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Auki. Now for the second question, our first student from Brawijaya, Rama Admiral.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Ambassador for giving us knowledge about how European Union head for the agenda. So I have a question. Since we know that the European Union have policy about accepting migrants across the world, so how does COVID-19 affect European Union immigrant policy? And is it some protocol that being changed or not? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't hear exactly. Could you repeat, please?
Okay. Since we know that European Union's members that have a policy about accepting migrants across the world, so how does COVID-19 affect European Union immigrant policy? And is it some protocol that being changed or not?
So to reiterate your question, that was how does the COVID-19 pandemic affect EU's policy on refugees and migrants? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. And we still have one more question. Is there anybody who wants to raise their hand? Maybe from Brawijaya, maybe? If not, we'll hand it over back to Ambassador Piket. Please. Oh, sorry. We have one from UMM, so we'll take that before moving on to the next batch. Muhammadiyah.
So, can you listen my voice?
Yes, it's clear.
All right. I was want to talking about the European Union about the tourism. My question is how the European Union can decide how can enter the European Union, because since 1 July, European Union has opened the tourism's border for tourisms. That's my questions.
All right, thank you. Back to you, Ambassador.
All right, thank you for another set of interesting questions. The first question from Oki about Islamophobia, about how the EU can deal with that, and particularly right now. Now, my first answer would be to send many Indonesian students, many Indonesians, majority Muslim and so on, to send them to European universities, to show your faces there, to meet with the people, and to show everybody how nice and friendly you are. It's a very simple way of putting, making it concrete what I mean by the fact that educational exchange brings people together. It opens people's eyes, it makes friendships, and it dismantles prejudices and biases and phobias and so on. That is true on both sides, of course. It's true for the student who goes to Europe or who comes here, but it's also true for the receiving side. And for that reason, we every year we fund a fair number of scholarships for Indonesian students to come here, as well as for Indonesian students to go to European union universities, and for Europeans to come here. The program is called Erasmus. Look it up on our website and to find out about it. This year, there are many different kinds of scholarships there. One is more the institutional exchange for half a year, for a year, which works very well. And the other is individual grants for students from here spending up to 2 years for academic research, mostly up the master's level. Now, that is bringing people together in a concrete way, I think is one important contribution to deal with phobias of whatever sort. Secondly, let's not believe that you can solve every phobia and every Islamophobia in that way. Because for again, a very simple reason, that the Islamophobia in Europe, where it exists, it's by far not everybody, but where it exists, has been prompted, helped develop by the economic crisis of 2009, fewer jobs, etc., and some jobs taken by people from elsewhere. And secondly, by the fact that there's been a fair number of terror attacks in Europe carried out by fanatics, extreme, violent extremists, as we call them in polite language. Now, it means that, okay, you can promote interreligious dialogue, faith groups, and so on, between Islamic people and others. That's certainly important. But B, we have to deal with the violent extremists as well. Because for as long as that exists, for as long as radicalism is perceived as causing danger to our fabric of life, we have not dealt with one of the causes of the issues. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. The third thing is migration, has been irregular migration. And in the case of Europe, much of the irregular migrations comes from countries in Northern Africa or countries just south of the Sahara, and majority Muslim, and people's worry about migration, about irregular migration in particular, got somehow amalgamated, interlinked with people's worry about Islamic people. So, in other words, we have to certainly look at migration policies, migration practices, and in order to deal with another root cause. And in fact, that's what we've been doing. It links in with the question asked by Brawijaya. COVID impact on refugees and migration. First of all, our refugee policy will not change, because that is something it's very, very fundamental to our values fabric, giving shelter, helping the people who are kicked out of the countries by war, by conflict, by despots, etc. So that won't change. What we practice that ourselves, and we also call on other countries to practice it as well. And here, let me say one thing. Indonesia, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, giving shelter to 94 Rohingya boat refugees landing on the shores of Aceh. The EU issued a statement, public statement on that, welcoming this courageous decision, which shows an abidance by international law on the side of Indonesia. And so we see Indonesia very much as a partner in this field. So refugees, we will always aim to help. Migration, irregular migration, I've already partly answered the question. There is a sense that the access to Europe was too easy, and that unmanageable numbers of people came to our shores, particularly in the south of Italy, in Greece, in Spain, and particularly in unmanageable ways. And that is, simply something that we cannot sustainably allow to continue. So the response has been a couple things. First of all, try and help deal with the root causes of such irregular migration. Not easy. take the case of Libya, Northern Africa. Don't know what war it is there, a civil war, but there is war, and there's a lack of state, and as a result, there is plenty of scope for people with human traffickers without scruples to send refugees from Chad, from Niger, from Nigeria, etc., onto the Mediterranean in boats that are absolutely not seaworthy. So we have to deal with the conflict in Libya in order to deal with the irregular migration and the human trafficking that happens through Libya. No easy task, but that's a task. The same for other countries in Northern Africa, where you have conflict, where you have poverty, where you have famine, you have drought, and so on. And of course, the magnet of Europe is so strong that people will risk their lives in order to get there, and sometimes with fatal consequences. So dealing with root causes is a key thing. Lastly, burden sharing, which means that if many of irregular migrants land in the south of Italy, then of course this is unbearable for Italy, and the people, the irregular migrants do not necessarily wish to stay in Italy. They want to go further north to the other parts of Europe where they hope to find employment, and but still they can't go there because Italy, of course, has the task to maintain order, and the irregular migrants end up in detention camps, etc. Now, burden sharing means that other member states help to relieve Italy part of that burden and to take some of these detained irregular migrants to their country. Very controversial debate. Open about that. I must be open about that. I hear a second discussion ongoing. I must be open about that. There's some member states who resist that notion. So it's not an unresolved discussion inside the European Union, but that is what the EU lawmaker has put forward and as an approach to the problem. I don't see a direct impact of COVID, to be frank. You could imagine one in case the pandemic in certain African countries or in the Middle East gets totally out of hand, but I haven't seen that yet at this point. The third question from Mohammed about tourism and about entry into the EU. The EU is opening its external borders. Up to the 1st of this month, we had exactly the same regime as does Indonesia. That is to say, no non-essential travel into the EU by anybody from any third country. Now, from the 1st of July this month, therefore, a number of countries have been declared as being countries that have an equivalent level of safety and so on. And people from those countries can again enter the EU from the outside. Right now, there's 15 countries on that list, and but not Indonesia. And many others, of course, but not Indonesia. And for now, the Brussels lawmaker has considered that the conditions weren't yet right for it. No. Will this change? Yes, it will change. I can't say when. This is a fairly technical analysis behind this, following a number of published criteria, which everybody can read, about what the EU, how the EU judges evaluates countries' safety for entry into the EU. I can't go into the crystal ball on that. One very interesting thing, and that is that even for countries who are not yet on the list, the EU has said we will admit students who come to Europe for exchange programs. So, in other words, Mohammed, if you were to have enrolled in a European exchange program, then you would be able to travel to Europe even now. So I think that's a very interesting bit of good news.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. And for our third and final batch, we have 3 students lined up. So first, from Rama Prakampa.
Okay, so is it clear for my voice?
Yep.
All right. So thank you for your opportunities, the Ambassador of European Union. So basically, like there's so many coronavirus pandemic has spread through the world, right? Especially in the countries that probably might face the coronavirus, and yeah, there's a lot of things happen during this pandemic era. So the question is like, how EU strengthens the actions to tackle disinformation, since that we are probably faced a lot of disinformations during this pandemic that is actually more dangerous than the virus itself. So how the EU strengthens the actions to tackle this information? Thank you.
All right. And for the next question from Brawijaya, Ariel.
Can you hear my voice clearly?
It's quite. Could you speak up?
Oh, is it clear now?
Maybe a little bit closer to the mic.
Okay.
There you go.
What about now?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. I would like to ask regarding racial bias and discrimination.
I think it would help if you turned off your video.
During COVID-19 lockdown.
Well, Ariel? Ariel, I think you can turn off your video and use your audio instead to help. Try turning off your video and using the audio instead.
Okay. I already did turn off my video.
Perhaps it would help if you use the chat box instead to ask your question, and I'll move on to the next person, and we'll get back to your question in the chat box.
Is my voice clear right now?
It's still a little choppy. Yes. You could type your question in the chat box, and we'll get back to you. All right. So to our next question from Brawijaya, Raden Bagus. Raden Bagus. All right.
Okay, is my voice clear enough? Is my voice clear?
Yes, clear.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Danu, and I'm from Brawijaya University. My question is, there is a growing trend in Indonesia regarding tourism, where more Indonesians from year to year spend their time outside of the country for holidays. At least in 2019, at least 9 million of Indonesians spend their time outside of Indonesia for holiday. Majority of those people did not go to Europe. However, a significant part of it, not majority, but significant part of it went to Europe. So my question is, while most of our neighbors, like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they are enjoying the visa-free policies from many Schengen countries in EU. But Indonesia, I think since the beginning of this year, we will have to pay more fees and we'll have to wait longer in order to get Schengen visa. So what were the measures and the consideration that these EU countries that are part of Schengen took when they decided to make it a little harder for Indonesians to visit Europe for holiday? Thank you.
Thank you, Raden. And lastly, for the question earlier by Ariel, on the chat box, he asked, according to Amnesty International's report called Policing the Pandemic, it stated that police enforcing COVID-19 lockdowns across Europe have targeted ethnic minority and violence, discriminatory identity checks, forced quarantines, and fines. For example, in Saint-Denis, the poorest area of mainland France, where the majority of inhabitants are Black or of North African origin, the number of fines for breaching the lockdown was 3 times higher than in the rest of the country. Therefore, as a representative of the EU, what is your take on this issue, and what can the EU do to prevent such actions by local governments, and whether or not EU has some kind of punishment for unlawful force? Yes. And with that, I'll give the floor back to you, Ambassador.
All right, thanks a lot. Question from Rama about this information. Sorry. Now, I think it's fair to say that the EU has become acutely aware of this problem. Over the past couple of years, in fact, but the COVID crisis has only made that awareness even stronger, and we've realized that there are processes happening that are, if not state-run, at least state-tolerated or sponsored, and that aim at spreading misinformation about who we are, what we do, and how we look upon things, and in a totally unacceptable way. Just a month ago, for that reason, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy published a policy document on this for discussion by member states with some concrete actions in it that basically have to do with simply helping people from the EU level, but also at member states, in the identification of sources of false information, of willfully false information, and of interventions through cybercrime in our governance systems. Very delicate, very difficult, because of the nature of that activity. But have a look at the text. It's published on our website. Disinformation. If you do that word, you will find it. Now, what is key is, of course, that action that we undertake in this regard, however necessary and however hard we want to play this, have to protect and against taking away the normal freedoms that we believe in at the same time, in fact, the freedoms of speech, of media, etc. It's those very freedoms that the perpetrators of disinformation campaigns themselves don't believe in, but they willingly abuse these rights if it comes to interference in other countries, such as Europe. So, but we pursue that these freedoms. We will protect them, and because that is part of our values, ideological makeup at the very core of it. But a very important area of work, and challenging and new, and clearly something on which we wish to dialogue with Indonesia as well. Now, Ariel, you typed a very long question in this in the few seconds you had while the third person asked this question, and I must admit I haven't read this report, and so I'm unable to comment on what it says, and just however much I respect Amnesty International as an organization, since I haven't read the report, I will not comment on it. But your question is very topical, evidently, with the sudden rise of the non-discrimination campaign globally after the events in the United States. So I think all of that has raised an awareness amongst everybody, and we have to be self-critical, very frank and open, not aggressive, but open manner. We analyze ourselves and the beliefs we have and the objectives. Do we practice them sufficiently or not? And is there double standards in things when it comes to ethnicity and so on? So now we've only started that discussion now, I think, with intensity. It's always been there, but it's a difference between having things in law, in writing, and actually doing them in practice and getting results. The EU's law book is extremely strong on non-discrimination of whatever kind, whether it's gender, whether it's the color of your skin, whether it's religion, whether it's sexual orientation. Very, very strong. And so the legal rights as such are very strongly protected. And anybody can take their police or their government or whoever to court if they believe that those rights have been infringed upon. So, which is a great basis, but clearly one has to go further. One has to self-analyze and see what we can do more to avoid abuse, to avoid aberrations, and so forth. And that's the process I think we've started, intensified right now. And yeah, so that's what I would say. General answer to your rather specific question. Then lastly, the question from Daniel or Radin, I don't know, about the visa policy of the EU. Yes, I'm afraid we still have a visa requirement for Indonesian nationals coming to Europe. It's been there for a long time, so there's nothing new. Nothing new has happened on the 1st of January. What did happen on the 1st of January is is the entry into force of new conditions. Now, you quote one of them, and that is a slightly higher fee, and I admit it, the fee is slightly higher. But you didn't mention the two other conditions, and I will quote them to you. And that is that we have massively simplified the visa processes by giving Indonesian nationals the possibility of having 1 year visas, not 90 days as it used to be, but 1 year for the entire Schengen zone. And secondly, multiple entry. So during your year in Europe, go out, come back in on one and the same visa. So I think two important improvements, two important simplifications, and two important tools whereby we can produce more contact between Europe and Indonesia, and through tourism, through study, etc. So I hope, rather than that, I have made you a little bit less unhappy, or maybe even a little bit happier than when you asked me the question.
All right, and I think we can cut it there. So I'm sure everyone has many questions, but unfortunately we can't take them all because of time constraints. But thank you, Ambassador Piket, and thank you to all the students for your questions. Now, before we close, the ambassador has actually prepared a fun quiz for us. So if you answer the questions correctly, you will be receiving a goodie bag with cool gifts and prizes. And there are only going to be 3 questions, all multiple choice. So to answer, please use the raise hand feature, and I will choose the first ones that raise their hand. So let's begin the quiz. And question number 1. The European flag features a circle of stars on a blue background. They stand for the ideals of unity, solidarity, and harmony among the peoples of Europe. The question is, how many stars are there on the EU flag? Is it A, 6, B, 12, C, 24, or D, 27? Okay, the first person that raised their hand was Alki. What is your answer?
Of course, 12.
12. Is that the correct answer, Ambassador?
It is.
Okay, great.
Well
Congratulations, Alki. Well done. Please
you.
send your address to our team and we'll get the prizes to you. And the next question, number 2. The European External Action Service, or EEAS, is the EU's diplomatic service. It aims to make EU foreign policy more coherent and effective, thus increasing EU's global influence. The EEAS is led by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The High Representative is also a Vice President of the European Commission. Who is the current High Representative? Is it A, Federica Mogherini, B, Catherine Ashton, C, Joseph Borrell, or D, Ursula von der Leyen? Okay, from Brawijaya, Rama Admiral.
Joseph Borrell.
Joseph Borrell. Is that correct, Ambassador?
Correct.
Nice. Okay, congratulations. And lastly, last question, number 3. Last May, the High Representative briefed the EU and Security Council and stated that the EU remains deeply attached to the rules-based international order, to multilateralism, and to the United Nations. He also said that the EU supports the UN, not only with words, not only with money, but also to develop concrete actions and contributions across the 3 pillars of the UN, and especially on peace and security. What are the other 2 UN pillars? Is it A, human rights and development, B, culture and humanitarian aid, C, defense and non-proliferation, or D, immigration and health? Raise your hand if you know the answer. Don't Google anything. Oh no, I don't think they know the answer. Any guesses? A, B, C, or D? Try your luck. Okay, from Brawijaya, Theo Geralt.
Human right?
Human rights and development, A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct answer.
Well,
All right.
I grant you that one. You said only half of the, I gave only half of the answer, but human rights and development.
Was that a lucky guess? Yes. All right. Okay. Thank you to the winners. We've come to the end of the quiz, and congratulations. And we will be contacting you after this to send your prizes. Now, to wrap up today's discussion, do allow me to give a brief summary for our conversation today. So I would like to highlight 7 points. The first is in dealing with COVID-19, investment and research in finding the right vaccine for COVID-19 is the EU priority. The EU believes the vaccine should be accessible to all, especially to poorer countries who has lesser capacities in developing vaccines. Concrete solidarity and global efforts are necessary, and the EU supports the WHO as a vital organization in the battle against COVID-19 without neglecting the idea to review the institution's performance. Number 2 is about economic rebound. EU stands to help all member states in recovering the economy by providing financial assistance. And for poor countries who have less resources in dealing with the pandemic, one big focus for the EU is to help those countries to revive the economy. EU is also focused on solving the problem of social inequality, which is not only affecting developed economies, but also obviously for developing economies. The EU is making available a lot of funding for this, which is 20 billion euros in total for third countries, among that 20 million euros for Indonesia alone. And the funding is combined efforts as the symbol of solidarity and cooperation of all member states. Number 3 is the impact on global trade. The crisis has made our global trade become more vulnerable, and as liberalization has increased dependencies among countries, many nations are localized and nationalized the industries. The EU is not taking that as an option. The best formula for the EU is to diversify the supply chain and develop more free trade areas across the globe and restructure the economic deals to make sure everybody gets mutual benefits. The EU will always support the multilateralism platform in addressing the issue of economic disparities and inequalities. Number 4, the global agenda on climate change. COVID-19 pushed the climate change agenda to the background. For EU, the agenda should be developed based on green recovery plans, and the Green Deal should be supported, which is covering the issue in relation to energy, agriculture, eco-friendly industries, carbon-neutral economy. And EU and Indonesia will always work together in developing the green and sustainable agenda. Number 5, for global peace, all multilateral organizations, the UN, ASEAN, G20, etc., should be able to always support the global peace agenda. Indonesia has been very actively involved on the global peace efforts, for instance, the UN peacekeeping operation and active involvement in the UN Security Council. Number 6, on human rights. All governments need to create a better system in fulfilling the human rights of the population. Equal healthcare and access is one of the many important rights of the population that should be protected. And lastly, number 7, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the European integration, which was one of the questions earlier. The EU will continue to evolve. It will be influenced by the geoeconomics and geopolitics constellation. And the ambassador does not think that the COVID-19 will affect the European integration. The Eurosceptic politics are existing, but the importance of EU leadership remains high, seen from the support of many pro-EU parties. And with that, I would like to give the floor back to Ambassador Piket for his closing remarks or any message you have for the students.
Well, thanks very much, Cindy, and congratulations with that summary so quickly in real time. And so just to greet all the participants, thank you for your interest and thank you for your questions. They were good questions, and I hope that you have picked up something from this discussion. Follow the EU, how it will evolve in the coming weeks, months, and years. Contribute to thinking about the EU for the understanding of the EU itself, but also for ideas that you can garner from our experience for ASEAN's path of integration, sister organization in many respects. And so do that well. And lastly, I look forward to visiting Malang and to visit your universities. I will certainly be able to do that at some point during my tenure. But before that happens, I wish you all the very best. Keep safe. Manage your health for yourself, for your families, for your friends, and just make that small but important contribution that each and every individual citizen, you, I, Cindy, all have to make to getting the virus under control. So thanks very much, and I enjoyed it a lot, and hope to see you soon.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. And before we close, I would like to invite everybody for a virtual photo shoot. So if everybody could look at their camera and smile, and we'll take a quick picture. All right, Wahyu, are you ready to screenshot?
Okay, so everybody, please put your best face and turn on your camera because we will take a picture, but because there's a lot of people, I will take maybe 2 through 3 picture. Okay, so okay, for first, yeah, ready in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, once again,
Maybe
3,
freestyle.
2, 1. Once more. For another. Okay, in 3, 2, 1. And last one. In 3, 2, and 1. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Wahyu, and
Thank you,
everybody. With that, we have come to the end of our ambassadorial lecture today. Once again, thank you very much to His Excellency, Ambassador Vincent Piket, for your time, and also to all the students who have joined today. We hope to see you in our future events. Good afternoon. Bye-bye, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.